This is Mubilu Musoke with Democratization of Africa, the case of Uganda in comparative perspective. During our last conversation, we mainly talked about democracy in traditional systems. And I think the myth that there was always democracy in traditional systems was exposed, and we discovered that actually some systems were democratic and others were not, and we gave a few examples. Today, the conversation will continue with the themes of democratization of traditional systems. In this particular conversation, we outline 6 themes that sum up our democratization argument. These themes are, first, the lessons we can learn from the disastrous mistakes committed in the misconceived first attempt at democratization in the 1960s, soon after independence. Second, there is the biased question whether African traditional institutions and norms can be democratic, to which we have given a definitive answer. Third, the restoration of African traditional systems and norms in Uganda in the 1990s is a very good example of a form of democratization through restoration of previously abolished traditional institutions and norms. Fourth, democratization is inherently part of social change, and therefore constitutes fundamental desirable transformation of the society that facilitates democratization and sustains it. And fifth, the debate whether or not culture is a causal factor in democratization can finally be answered. And lastly, the crucial role of the judiciary in the process of democratization and the elimination of some customary rules and norms and bad laws which have been ignored by scholars is one of the most important component in democratization. Democratization is also a process in this particular last case of cleansing the legal system of the repressive laws used by dictators, some of them originating from the colonial era, to suppress the people and deprive them of their political freedom. Let us look at the disastrous mistakes that were committed in the first attempt to quote-unquote democratize Africa. In order to achieve democracy or enhance and strengthen it, where it existed in the traditional system, in the original traditional society. The first step is to avoid, remove, or correct past mistakes. Two of these mistakes stand out. One of them was the result of dictatorship. Soon after independence, African leaders abolished multi-parties and embraced socialism. They also abolished African traditional institutions on the ground that they were not democratic. And some of these were replaced with socialist institutions. Nevertheless, the African leaders justified socialism and one-party regimes on the ground that socialism among the Western institutions was the closest to African traditional political institutions. Obote, for example, in 1967, abolished the monarchies on the ground that they were not democratic. Obote's so-called democratization was obviously a contradiction, which history eventually corrected through the restoration of the monarchies in 1990s, and later provided for in the Constitution of 1995. Clearly, this restoration, though, was in a diluted form, as we shall discuss the Constitution of 1995 itself later on. The second mistake was committed by Eurocentrism, which purported to apply quote-unquote universal knowledge about democracy and, inevitably, democratization. The Western scholars viewed African traditional institutions as inherently undemocratic and or primitive because they did not fit into the Western democratic political model of individual participation and representation, determined through the process of one man, one vote. There is a lot to learn from both mistakes, both the African leaders' mistakes and the Eurocentrism. We decided to respond to these two mistakes by reconstructing the original African society, rather than respond in rhetorical arguments and criticism in order to refute the two grave misconceptions about democracy. Those who did not listen to my previous conversation maybe will catch up as I try to incorporate earlier arguments in this particular conversation. The listener should make up his or her mind after listening to the whole conversation. A few illustrations will suffice, however. In the case of Uganda, for example, we have demonstrated that some of the original traditional social institutions were democratic. Therefore, there was no justification to abolish them on the erroneous allegation that they were not only undemocratic, but also anachronistic. The act of abolishing these traditional institutions was therefore misconceived. It violated the human rights of the people who ultimately owned those institutions. The abolition of those institutions was a violation of the human rights of the people who owned those institutions. Those institutions existed by virtue of the consent of their cultural owners. It is irrelevant that some Ugandans who purported to declare themselves quote-unquote Republicans did not believe in the validity of those institutions. We must remember that the protection of political freedom must be based on the assumption that tolerance of what others believe is a necessary virtue in a democratic system. Unfortunately, uniformity, which was the underlying premise of communism and socialism, cannot be achieved without violating the rights of others who dissent. Democratization, by either abolition of traditional institutions or their replacement with the socialist ones, as Obote and Nyerere did, respectively, was a mistake which should not be repeated. Both Obote and Nyerere abolished traditional institutions and replaced them with the socialist ones, which they mistakenly believed to be democratic. In both cases, the blind driving force behind the changes to democratization was ideological, which completely ignored the possibility that the fact that people had vested rights in their traditional institutions, to which they consented, and therefore democratically owned those institutions. Fortunately, these misconceived and undemocratic actions have been reversed in Uganda. Traditional institutions have been restored throughout Uganda except Ankole, and the reasons were given during my previous conversation. Let us look, secondly, to the second theme, the restoration of abolished institutions. Uganda is a very good example of the reversal of the abolished traditional institutions, which was done as a form of democratization in 1967. During the constitutional debate of 1994, the majority of Ugandans, with the exception of Ankole, as we have indicated already, decided to restore their abolished traditional institutions, not only in Buganda, but also in Acholi, Alu, Bogishu, Bonyoro, Busoga, Lang, Rwenzururu, Teso, Toro, West Nile, and the various areas, different areas, Busoga. This was democratization through restoration of traditional institutions. The only question that arises today is whether the restored institutions need any further democratization through reform. My answer is unequivocally yes. All institutions, whether traditional or modern, democratic or not, due to the inevitability of social change, need reform at some point. Reform should be viewed as improvement of the same institution so that the institution can achieve its original objectives more effectively. Using the model adopted in this conversation, we shall suggest some reforms which can be applied to traditional institutions and norms that may need reform and or democratization. In Uganda, for example, democratization can be viewed at two levels. These two levels are the political and the social levels. First, we look at the social level. Traditional rules for sex equality under the monarchy can be reformed, for example, with the purpose of updating them and making them work better. For example, the two ancient institutions in Uganda of Lubuga and Narinya can be strengthened and updated through reform in order to mitigate the impact of patriarchal rule, while at the same time promoting equality as originally intended by the original Chiganda society. Equality is a very important component of democracy. Everywhere you go, every culture you consider. In the case of Lubuga in Uganda, we can strengthen the institution by requiring the male heir to be required to seek the advice of Lubuga in making certain substantive decisions affecting the family or the rights of the members of the clan or family in specific cases or areas of customary jurisdiction. There has been some legal reforms in Uganda protecting a woman's rights to inherit or share in property owned by the husband. In distributing property within the family or clan, it may be important to empower Lubuga with a veto or be given joint powers in implementing existing laws. The problem of conflict of laws between statutory and customary laws is not, in my opinion, a major factor that can prevent the reforms I'm suggesting, especially the clans derive their jurisdiction from customary law, which is separate from the state system. The purpose of the reform is to prevent irresponsible male heirs from abusing their power in discharging their customary responsibilities. Lubuga's veto.
We have a call.
Excuse me?
We have a call.
Okay.
A caller?
Yes, Voice of Uganda Radio.
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Hello,
yes,
go ahead.
Yes. Thank you guys for what you've done, and Mr. Mubilu, we really appreciate your effort and the program. I have one question. Many people have been asking me about what memorandum of understanding which the Uganda signed with the central government. Is there any way you can explain us more on what the memorandum of understanding? That means that we are going to get, Uganda is going to get its own properties, or there's still some sticky points attached before it really becomes final, because we really don't understand memorandum of understanding. What we thought that Museveni had granted, has given the Uganda some of its properties back. Please explain us more about that. Thank you very much.
I can't do very much about that because, first of all, a memorandum of understanding is not an agreement, is not a contract. It doesn't say that Party A owns this and Party B will give Party A 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A memorandum of understanding, as far as I know, is a political document. It simply states the intentions of the two parties to the memorandum. So, since it is not a legal document, a contract, because I have not read the content, I've only seen it, the reports of the news in the newspapers. I cannot really tell you that it guarantees to restore certain properties or which properties, but I know that they talk about restoration of the Saza, Magombo properties, but I cannot be more specific than that. And so I will disappoint you happily because I don't want to give you false information, which I'm not privy to the memorandum of understanding which was signed. However, I can also say that Voice of Uganda Radio can publicize this information and can communicate to the people the different ways to handle this situation, and that kind of mobilization can influence eventually the outcome of the process, the actual agreement that will be reached in the end. The fact that, though, that the Baganda had the courage, or Kungora Museveni, when he was speaking, that is very encouraging because I have always talked about you cannot be free until you overcome pathological fear, which the Baganda, most of the Baganda have. They fear the state, they fear the government, they fear Museveni. And so it was a very good moment for the kingdom of Uganda, or Kungola Museveni, when he is standing before a lot of people on the occasion of celebrating the anniversary of the restoration of the kingdom. So maybe that answer is not satisfactory, and I don't expect it to be, but that's the best I can do to this particular moment. If there is no other question, I will continue with my conversation of how to reform the traditional institutions, and I was talking about the Rubuga. So I believe Rubuga's veto of all shared executive powers, if ignored, could lead to seeking adjudication in a family court to resolve the issue. Any answer with any system, in a democratic system, by the way, has checks and balances, and this is what I'm talking about Lubuga having executive powers or even a veto in dealing with family property in Uganda. A system with checks and balances works best when designed to counter the elements of human nature and conflicts that may arise during a dispute. In other words, Lubuga's function should not be strictly formal as it is today. The situation of Nalinya is similar to that of Lubuga. Those of you who know Uganda very well, these two institutions, by the way, are equivalent. Lubuga is for the monarchy, and Nalinya is for the monarchy, and Lubuga is for the ordinary Ugandans. The two institutions were actually designed to be socially equivalent in all respects. Praise must go to those who designed the two institutions. In the case of Nalinya, Kabaka is assumed to have all the substantive executive powers which he exercises through the Katikkiro as a constitutional monarch. As in the case of Lubuga, Nalinya, in the interest of sexual equality within Buganda Kingdom, can be given substantive powers to influence kingdom policies from a feminine perspective. At present, the Nalinya is a ceremonial title with no substantive power or authority, but it may be in the interest of promoting the rights of women in the kingdom for Nalinya to be empowered with executive advisory powers exercisable jointly with the Kabaka. For example, in appointing ambassadors, a female input in the exercise of the Kabaka's executive powers may be a healthy move in the interest of cultural development of the kingdom and making the monarchy a truly people's institution. Other reforms to democratize the institution of the Kabakaship or the kingship may include election of the members of the Lukiko parliament instead of the traditional way of Kabaka appointing them. We should remember that politics is an art which has to be learned. It requires practice in order to use it effectively and successfully. That will make the Buganda politicians within Buganda acquire experience and political skills similar to those from other areas where elected representatives representation is done. This reform will require more explicit recognition and implementation of the constitutional monarchy principle. I have heard two non-compelling arguments against this type of reform. First, it is argued that from time immemorial, the Kabaka has had the power of appointing the members of Lutiko. Therefore, he should continue to do so regardless of any consequences. This, to me, is a blind argument. We should not do things simply because they have been done that way in the past. When we look at other monarchies in Europe which have been democratized and in fact strengthened by democratization as a result, traditional rules and norms have been changed over the course of the centuries of their existence. In England, for example, long before it became UK, United Kingdom, the monarch had the sole power to appoint members of his councils, which subsequently evolved into an elected parliament. In other words, that was democratization as well as strengthening the monarchy through the principle of constitutional monarchy. Electing parliament, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries in England, strengthened the English monarchy. That is how it became United Kingdom through the union with Scotland. The second argument rejecting the election of members of the Lukiko in Buganda is based on demographics. It is argued that the ethnic composition of Buganda has been so diversified that any attempt to elect a Lukiko, the Lukiko will bring in non-Baganda who will then dominate Buganda. I call this the scare tactic argument, which has no foundation. It makes two false and absurd assumptions. First, it overestimates the number and political strength of non-Baganda in Buganda. Unless the non-Baganda in Buganda are more than the Baganda, that is more than 50% of the population, there is no statistical foundation or validity to the demographics argument. But even worse, the argument is really founded on the presumption of political incompetence of the Baganda in Buganda. It is assumed that when you hold a free and fair election in Buganda, the non-Baganda will always win. That is a pathetic argument. Look at all the members of parliament from Buganda. What percentage of the MPs from Buganda are non-Baganda? Why should the political odds suddenly change when you are electing the Buganda Lukiko? The worst implication of this argument is that the Baganda are politically incompetent, and therefore, when it comes to open political competition, the Baganda will necessarily lose. But this argument also completely ignores the contemporary policy at Mengo. The Kabaka, Mutedi, has included non-Baganda in his government. Some of these non-Baganda have been Indians of Asian descent. So, the argument of preventing Buganda, Buganda government from preserving the Buganda government for Baganda and by Baganda does not reflect either the contemporary Mengo policy or the history of Buganda. Under Kabaka Suna, there was a plot to overthrow Katikkiro Kayiira because it was alleged he was not a Muganda. In fact, his mother was a Munyankole. But because his father was a Muganda, belonging to Mbogo or Buffalo clan, Kabaka Suna ruled in that particular case, and the ruling still stands today, that Kayiira was a Muganda and therefore qualified to be Katikkiro. The ruling in Kayiira's case could also be modified to suit the contemporary circumstances. For example, Kayiira was a Muganda according to Suna's ruling because his father was a Muganda, thereby making Kayiira by virtue of making him a Muganda by virtue of patriarchal descent. Children of Baganda women who have no other clans, say in Europe or America, have no clan to descent or to make them authentic Baganda, thereby making them, so that the point I'm trying to make here is that after all the princes and the princesses, they descend matrilineally, and so this Kayiira's ruling could be modified to affect Baganda women, that their children could descend matrilineally and become Baganda, because that is the only clan they have. Therefore, reform to allow children of Baganda women to become Baganda through matrilineal descent will not be either new or unique, a unique rule in Buganda, because the princes and the princesses, they follow the matrilineal descent principle. Much more recently, going back to our history, for example, Mengo and Mutesa II had representatives in parliament such as Daudi Ocheng, Anna Choli from Mitiana, who became part of the Mengo establishment. Therefore, fear of non-Baganda taking over Buganda, if you allow the Ruchiko to be elected, is nothing more than scare tactics, which have no foundation, and at worst, misplaced and misconceived. But there is also another solution to this problem. We can propose a bicameral House of Representatives in Buganda if and when Uganda becomes a federal system. The system would apply throughout Uganda if the rest of the Ugandans agree to it. One house could consist of members of elected to represent exclusively traditional institutions, and the other open to all residents of that particular area or state in the federation. Therefore, democratic imagination has no limit. Unfounded fears can be debunked with facts and reason. We should remember, too, that two important things. First, democratization is inevitable, whether you like it or you don't like it. It is part of social change. That is, and the social change, I must say, is part of the laws of history. You can't prevent them from taking place. That's why I am making these arguments based on what I have learned from history and comparative studies. Second, as I pointed out during the last conversation, those traditional systems in Ankole, Rwanda, Burundi, and Ethiopia, which were not democratic, paid the ultimate penalty by becoming extinct. We do not want Buganda system to become extinct for failure to democratize it. Democracy revitalizes political institutions. It breathes new life in political institutions. Therefore, only ignorance will resist democratization, whose main effect is to improve the quality of governance. We should carry out reforms that uphold the principle of a constitutional monarchy. This is the most effective way to revitalize the traditional institution. As to the general law of political extinction, modern undemocratic political systems, too, they face extinction because of the impact of the same general law of history in social evolution. Communism today is clearly an endangered species. Sooner or later, it will become extinct because it is undemocratic. Those who resist effective application of the constitutional monarchy principle should be accordingly warned. Democracy has at least 3 positive consequences on governance and administration, which help prevent extinction of political systems. First, democracy raises the level of accountability in the system to the highest possible level. This is mainly because democracy, by its nature, is an adversarial process. Second, by raising the level of accountability, democracy minimizes corruption. This has the effect of making the system healthy and efficient. Lastly, but not least, democracy injects legitimacy into political systems, thereby making the political systems acceptable and a part of the life of the people. Consent of the people is inconceivable in a system where legitimacy is questionable. For all these reasons, I would urge the Baganda to uphold the principle of constitutional monarchy in Buganda for the sake not only democratizing Buganda, but ensuring its political health and sociological strength. Let us now go back to reforming the social institutions which I was talking about before I diverted to this particular topic. Another area that needs reform has to do with the traditional norms that prohibit criticism of the Kabaka. The Kabaka is both an institution and a human being who is neither perfect nor infallible. It should therefore be appropriate to express honest criticism of what the Kabaka says, does, or fails to do as long as it is done respectfully. The traditional idea of not, quote, looking into the Kabaka's mouth, unquote, has outlived its usefulness in modern democratic environment. It is not politically healthy for the monarchy. The Kabaka should be respected and not feared, as was the case in the past. Lastly, there is a Uganda tradition which should not be abandoned in favor of Western norms. In Uganda, the women have their own names. They are given feminine clan names when they are born and feminine religious names according to their faith. From the original Uganda society, the norm was that a woman keeps her name throughout her life. This is an original dignified Uganda cultural norm, stretching back thousands of years to the original society which I described in my initial conversations. However, today, in spite of the feminist movement for equality, the Baganda women are in an ironical reversal of feminism, adopting the Western norms of taking their fathers' and husbands' names. This practice is culturally retrogressive in the context of promoting women's equal rights. It is also contradictory of everything feminists stand for in the name of equality. I would therefore urge Baganda women to be proud of the Uganda norms, not to adopt their husbands' and fathers' names. The Uganda cultural norms in this particular case are superior to those of the Western culture in view of the feminists' ultimate goal of equality of sexes. In fact, the West should learn from us. Prominent women like Hillary Rodham Clinton kept her maiden name until her husband was running for president, when she was literally forced to change her maiden name, which of course also belonged to a man because she took her father's name, by public opinion and the politics. For consistency, the same rule should apply to men. They should keep their given clan names instead of assuming or adopting the names of their fathers, as in the West. There is no such thing as a family name in Uganda culture. There is a clan name. Moreover, the Navagereka, wife of the Kabaka, keeps her maiden name. So should all Baganda women. Now I move to another aspect or third theme of democratization. Democratization assumes the existence of certain sociological conditions. This is because democratization, in order to take effect, in most cases requires social change before democratization takes effect. One of the reasons why dictators survived for a long time in Africa while brutally oppressing and sometimes even killing people is because they survived by spreading pathological fear of the state among the people. And we will come back to this theme later on in detail. But I'm giving it out so that you know what one of the themes of democratization is. Pathological fear of the state started under colonialism. It was made much worse after independence for the sole purpose of dictators hanging on to power indefinitely. People cannot both be free and at the same time are victims of pathological fear of the state. The first condition for people enjoying freedom is to liberate themselves from pathological fear of the state, which in its most intense form paralyzes political action in many African countries. And that's why we are where we are today, because of pathological fear. This issue will be explored more in the future conversations. Freedom from pathological fear of the state is essential for democratization, the democracy to thrive. The social paralysis created by pathological fear of the state is partly the absence of autonomous civil society. In later conversations, we shall explain the importance of civil society in that is diversified and autonomous from the state as a condition for the existence of democracy. The only way to create an autonomous, diversified civil society is for the people to enjoy the rights to assemble, associate, and express themselves freely. The dictators know this very well. And that's why they point their guns to people who try to enjoy these rights. In order to achieve this particular situation, to liberation from fear, the first thing is to get rid of, pathological fear of the state. There are two components that is autonomous civil society and the state cannot coexist with that pathological fear and democratization. So with social change is going to be a very, very important element in this process. Now I go to the fourth theme of culture as democratization causal factor, as a causal factor of democratization. Another intriguing factor in the democratization debate is culture. Culture, for good or worse, shapes our behavior, but may also condition us to tolerate dictatorship because of pathological fear of the state I have mentioned earlier. So, battered women, for example, have to be taught, literally taught, that they should not tolerate their terrible conditions simply because their wives, as dictated by customary or other cultural norms that make a male authority supreme within the marriage relationship. The same rule should apply to politics in general. People should not tolerate dictatorship or oppressive authority in any form for any reason without rising up to confront it. Freedom cannot be enjoyed by a slave who submits to his or her fate of slavery. Democratization and the enjoyment of freedom require liberation of the mind. Culture has also been used in history to argue that democracy is the result of Western culture creating the necessary conditions for democracy. This is what the culture theory we discussed at the beginning of these conversations erroneously teaches. We have demonstrated that this is not true for Africa. We shall demonstrate later that culture has not, in fact, played a significant role in the causation of democratization in the Western countries, where it is declared to be the original cause of democratization by the culture theory. We do not expect culture to play a major role in democratization of Africa. On the contrary, the process of democratization, because it is part of social change, creates a new culture. Moreover, culture did not, in the form of Weber's spirit of Protestant ethic, create or cause the emergence of democracy in the original society described earlier on in my conversations. The culture theory has unfortunately been reduced to an ideological dogma that may at first sound convincing to some, as if it was valid. In fact, its validity has been put in jeopardy by our conversations. The claim that Judeo-Christian values are the real basis of democracy in the West gives the false impression that either transplanting these values to non-Western countries or cultures will automatically democratize it, or that these cultures which have no Judeo-Christian values cannot be democratized. This is not so because Japan and India, two democratic giants in Asia, are democratic, but their cultural systems are not built on the so-called Judeo-Christian values. In fact, the values or culture of India and Japan are much closer to African culture of communal values than the individualist Judeo-Christian values of the West. Now, I look at I think it's time to take a short break, and when I come back in 5 minutes, we shall begin by discussing the role of the judiciary in democratization as one of the themes that will be pursued throughout these conversations. So I will step out for a few minutes and be back in 5 minutes.
omuguwamu gwetuga mwekateni omuguwamu gwensiba mwekateni mwetuga ebikisawano ku lufuzi wabimanya nga byebimu ddala n'ebyo byokolerako ng'obuututya katonda kyekikulembera n'okumalira abantu mu makomera nga tebawezezza wabula osiba busibi okutta abantu nga ttaaba olusejjera okwegattooga ng'oyita mu nkene enguzi n'omulimu gw'okufuuga mu ngeri enyiga ensi n'ogifuula ng'ekyokufuna kyo n'ogifuula ng'ekyobugagga kyo abagagga n'abagezi n'obamalawo abo abakulu b'eddiini n'obakijjanya abakubuulirira b'ofuula abalabiro ne basomesebwa ku maggwa ng'obali abo abazanyi b'emizannyo n'obakijjanya so nga ggwe weekola ebitarekeka kuzannyako leero ndoogedde nzi abange leero njakudde leero njakudde abange leero njakudde ebigambo abo bannamawulire eddembe n'olibajjako so nga gwosooka okukola ebisasamaza abiwandiikako kuvola naye asasamaza so nga gwosooka okukola ebisasamaza otuuki n'erediyo n'obyenfunza tafe abayiwa b'ennyimba n'okukijjanya so nga gwe weekola obusolo nekukwanjala ensonyiza ofuula obusungu n'otuwalala omala okutaana kamwenge ne weekazakaza nti alinnyimba ndi mutta okirisaani era ssebo tukugambako mu ngeri yaffe enkana odda ku kadaala n'ogaba nkola nnyo songa oli munyazi nkoze nnyo songa oli mutono ensi n'ogifuula ng'ekyobugagga kyo n'ogifuula ng'ekyokufuna kyo n'okulembera ddembe n'olibajjako abantu n'obabunzabunza mu nsi mwebazaalibwa enkya n'odda ku kadaala n'owoggana nkola nnyo songa oli munyazi nkoze nnyo songa oli mutono katonda amunyiivu olw'obufuzi bwo kyavaanyiko obufuzi nabubajjako naawonya abantu bebemudaganya byenyogeddeko mubikwate mulyoke mufune ekitiibwa ekingi bw'ofa erinnya loleke nga jjonjo erinnya loleke nga ddungi n'ebijjukizo bakuzungira mu nsiibo leero njogedde abange leero njagedde leero njogedde nasirika obwedda nze okusirika nkolinze leero njagedde abange leero njagedde nasirika nkolinze leero ntalinze leero njogedde
Buguzinga bulijjo ne mutabani wa zibalaba etoweerwa ab'engeeruddeeri n'ab'ekyamuli bambatumidde ndise buguzinga bulijjo ne muzzukulu wa namuguzi b'entuukeerwa dda neetaaya n'ab'ekasagga mbatumidde ndi wampologoma seesula n'erinnya oliwulidde bammanga b'ennyonyi abanzaala bannange mwebali mwayamba si alisubiddwa amakula gano olw'ebigambo by'enzimba ensi nga njagala nnyo mutegeere ebinaajo n'ensi yaffe bwe nditookiika mulise mufune ekitangaala ng'asongera ddala wavalenya tukooye n'entalo ezitaliggwa Abaganda twamatira kulwa Museveni olwali wano ndowooza n'engulu bategedde ekiyitibwa olutalo kiri n'abaganda bagamba tokalyadda akaddadda ab'engulu kye baatukola baki bakoze ekyatukola.
After the break, I continue the conversation with the role of the judiciary in democratization as a general theme. We'll go into details later, but as a general theme, the judiciary has a big role to play in democratization, as I will give you illustrations. Two elements which make the judiciary effective and consistent in dispensing justice should be made explicit. The first is political philosophy, which upholds the rights of the individuals to freely assemble, associate, and express themselves. Without political freedom, there can be no democracy, in my opinion. Much of the democratization that took place in England, for example, between 1215, when the Magna Carta, the great Magna Carta, was enacted, and 1688, when the British political revolution took place, was pioneered by great judges like Sir Edward Coke, who championed protection of the rights of the people against the institutions of the state. The principle of separation of powers, which evolved during the same period, was charted by judges and was a very important part of democratization process in England. Today we talk about separation of powers as something or expected to be part and parcel of democracy, but it took a while for these institutions and principles to evolve through the courts, when the courts did play a very, very important role. During the evolution of the principle of separation of powers, the diminution of the powers of the king and their transfer to the executive branch and parliament, a fundamental political philosophy of safeguarding the liberty of the individual was the guiding principle that activated democratization process. The Ugandan courts, when you look at them today, have not yet developed a judicial political philosophy to protect human rights effectively. They move from one decision to another without a unifying philosophical theme. The absence of a philosophy is clearly detectable in the decisions rendered by the Constitutional Court, for example. It is very, very conspicuous. This problem is actually far more serious and extensive than the judiciary. When one looks at the political parties from which most of the judges are recruited, the first thing one notices is in dismay is the absence of political philosophy in Ugandan politics in general. The political leaders, including the head of state, do not understand that it is the political philosophy which animates and holds together and distinguishes one political party from another. If you want to understand what I'm saying, you have to look at the Republican Party in the United States and the Democratic Party. They are very distinguishable. The same is true for the Labour Party and Conservative Party in Britain. It's very difficult to confuse or mistaken them. There is hardly a philosophical distinction between FDC, NRM, UPC, DP, and many 36 small parties. Worse still, NRM, which is currently in power, proudly declares itself in its constitution as a multi-ideological political organization, thereby displaying its philosophical bankruptcy to the whole world to see. NRM primary aim seems to be to corruptly seduce anybody on the streets of Kampala to blindly become a member of NRM. Can such a philosophically purposeless political party either democratize the country or appoint the best candidates who can inject political philosophy into the judicial decisions? You can give yourself the answer. As long as this philosophical deficit in the judicial law exists, democratization will continue to be defective and inadequate. The principle of supremacy of the Constitution as the source of law is the best judicial tool that should be used to democratize the political system by weeding out all the laws that are incompatible with the democratic process and the political freedom. Many of the laws on the books, like the law of sedition enacted under the colonial regime and amended by NRM in 1987 to add the so-called sectarian law to the law of sedition, was a repressive law until it was declared unconstitutional by the court in 2009. The existence of oppressive laws is a serious obstacle to democratization, which must be removed immediately. This means that no country needs a philosophically astute judiciary with a sharp vision for the protection of human rights. The courts can also use the same power to review and to control the abuse of the legislative power by Parliament. This happened, for example, when Parliament enacted the Political Organizations Act, and while doing so, purported to amend the Constitution by what we call in law legal infection, was using indirect means without following the required constitutional procedures. That was an abuse of legislative authority And wisely, the Constitutional Court declared that law void to the extent it was inconsistent with the Constitution. The Constitutional Court can also review the executive powers by holding their abuse of power either ultra vires or beyond the powers of the executive constitutional authority, and therefore void under the Constitution. I mentioned earlier some of the famous judges in England that pioneered the protection of human rights of the individual, like Edward Cook, and the creation of the principle of separation of powers. This was because of brave judges who feared no king and were sometimes themselves locked up in the London Tower. But they still confronted the king until they wrestled most of the power, executive power, from him and gave it to Parliament. But we should not only worry about legislations alone as being obstacles to democratization. Customary norms weaved within the social public can also be inconsistent with the Constitution and therefore be an obstacle to democratization. The purpose of the Constitution as the supreme law is to declare laws inconsistent with the Constitution void. The term laws under the Constitution includes customary law norms. Take, for example, female genital mutilation, or FGM. FGM is or was, at least until a few years ago, practiced in a small ethnic group, the Sebe. The practice of FGM is clearly a violation of the Constitution. First, it deprives the victim, who does not always see herself as a victim, by the way, of the natural pleasure by cutting certain female sexual organs, which is the organ which is the most sexually sensitive in the female body, and this is done to young girls who therefore have no consenting authority for that to happen. Second, this operation can cause adverse medical consequences. And lastly, almost as important, it is performed on minors who do not have the legal capacity to give either the consent to the operation or to allow whatever, to whoever does it to do it. The parents' consent is not sufficient in this particular case to validate the procedure. Such practice would be lawful, however, if practiced on mature women who freely agree to undergo the ritual operation because they have a constitutional right to consent to the operation. However, the Uganda has enacted a law recently which prohibits this particular practice. Section 2, this law is called the Prohibition of Female Genital Mutilation Act, 2010. Section 2 says that a person who carries out female genital mutilation commits an offense and is liable on conviction of imprisonment not exceeding 10 years. And not only that, but even if it appears that under this act, that even a mature female, if it is performed on a mature female, it is still an offense, which I find, if not ridiculous, very unusual, because when a person is mature enough to consent to such procedures, that should be their right to do so if they want it to happen. It is lastly, consent is important in performing these acts on minors. It is no longer a question now, a debatable issue, because the law which was passed prohibits it, even mature people from undergoing the same case. In the case of FGM, the customary practice could have been allowed to continue, provided it is practiced on mature females who voluntarily agree to undergo such an operation. A judicial ruling on the constitutionality of FGM will probably come sometime if somebody challenges this law. But chances are probably that the law will be upheld, because the practice is done on minors and not on mature women. And the complication is that the whole purpose of this ritual is it is done on girls to initiate them into womanhood in accordance with the tradition of the Sebe. So if it is not done on girls, it's too late for the mature woman who already has entered womanhood. So it becomes useless. But I'm yet to wait, knowing that there are people who could challenge this law. I'm waiting to see what will happen. The Bagisu Imbalu could also be affected, because it is performed on young teenage boys who do not have the legal capacity to give consent. The Bagisu too can preserve their cultural practice as long as they perform it on adults who voluntarily submit to it. It is illegal under the Constitution to force a mature man to undergo the Imbalu procedure involuntarily. Like FGM, though, among the Imbalu practiced by the Bagisu is a natural, a ritual that to initiate young boys into manhood. It therefore loses its customary purpose when performed on mature men. It is, however, important to point out that if circumcising female is objected to because it is mutilation, circumcising men should also be viewed by the courts as mutilation if the two sexes are to be treated equally. Second, the only exception to these practices under the Constitution, whether FGM or Imbalu, is when they are performed for purely religious reasons as opposed to cultural requirements. Separation of church and state protects those who do it for religious reasons. Many other customary norms are inconsistent with the Constitution, can be declared void. When judicial review is taken into account, democratization assumes a major role by testing the constitutionality of all laws against the test of what is democratic. All the oppressive laws on the books are nullified. Customary norms which are out of tune with democracy and gender equality are rejected, and legislative and executive actions that are ultra vires are declared void. So you can see that we have a problem dealing with these issues because if a custom is not simply a custom but also a religious issue, then the separation of church and state comes in and you can't touch it. For example, the Jews, the Muslims, they do perform these functions and you can't stop them because they are done for religious reasons, and you cannot confuse customary rules with religious norms. That is very, very important, and I want you to take that into account to clearly to draw the distinction between the customary rules and the religious norms. The religious norms are protected. Their sanctity is protected by separation of church and state, whereas the customary rules are not, and they can be outlawed anytime if and when a court thinks that they violate the Constitution. There are two cases which have been declared by the Constitutional Court, which I want to mention, which have contributed to democratization recently in Uganda. There is the Onyango Obo's case. Onyango Obo and another person, a journalist, they published a story in their newspaper, and they were arrested and charged with publishing a false rumor, false report. And the original court ruled that they committed an offense. They challenged their prosecution, and they went to Constitutional Court. And Constitutional Court upheld the lower court, but then they went to the Supreme Court, and they won because that provision in the Penal Code publishing a false report. By the way, the false report was supposed to be just a story which said that according to a newspaper report, the Kabila was shipping gold or some other, minerals and whatever worth to Uganda, to Museveni in particular, and so on. So when they published this story, and they got it from another newspaper, by the way, of course, the Ugandan government did not like it very much, naturally. They charged them with publishing a false report. And definitely the Supreme Court, they held, and the Constitutional Court too, they held that violated the freedom of expression because you cannot, it's very difficult to know what report is not going to be false. If you make one small mistake, and the story happens to be, although you believe it, and it happens to be false, then you are charged with the crime. And the state had too much power, and it can misuse that power. And in fact, they had misused that power. By the way, it was not only Uganda. Many African countries had this provision. Ghana had it, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Uganda, they all had this false report provision in the Penal Code, and it was designed to suppress political freedom, the freedom of the press. But anyway, the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court declared this law invalid, null and void. And so that's a big role, a positive role played by the court in the process of democratization. In other words, upholding the rights of the people to freedom of expression and publishing stories which they desire to do. And then there is another case, Obo again, and Mwenda. I think you've heard of these two before. In Obo and Mwenda, they were charged with sedition. You know how slippery that charge of sedition is. The sedition means, just saying something that brings a certain individual, a leader like Museveni, into public disaffection. It's as vague as that. If you publish something, that brings the government or the whatever, or the president in public disaffection, then you've committed sedition. This one also, the Supreme Court ended up invalidating it. And I think that it was a very good ruling. It opened up a lot. You cannot charge anybody for sedition in Uganda anymore. However, this sedition in 1987, NRM amended the sedition law and added the sectarian provision within that law. When the court declared the law of sedition unconstitutional, they did not, maybe not surprisingly, declare the sectarian part of it unconstitutional. And yet, to prove both crimes, you have to prove the same elements, that you published something, and that publication caused ill will or ill feeling among the people. That's what the sectarian law, the portion is. And that one is still part of the law. I don't know when it will be struck out, because it is a political, it is used for political purposes and not really to either uphold or increase the security of the state. So I bring out these particular ones to say that the courts play a very big role in democratization, and we haven't gone far enough. We are just nibbling at the edges at this particular time. And I think I should put that particular issue of the themes to rest and go to the next step. And what I'm trying to move to next is the what I call the theme of democratization in broader perspective. This will involve discussing greater issues in more detail. The content. It will discuss our next conversation is going to be about the content of human rights, which is, I think, the very essence of what democratization is all about. No word is more frequently invoked in political rhetoric than the word democracy. I'm sure you know all that. Dictators use it to justify their repressive policies against the people. Military rule across Africa in the 1960s and 70s was rationalized in the name of democracy, quote unquote. In fact, initially, the mission of military rule in Africa was, ironically enough, justified as a means to democratize Africa. I hope those of you old enough can remember that. The apartheid regime was described by some as democratic because it was elected. The regime was elected compared to the African one-party regimes which dominated the entire African continent. Those who waged the liberation war against apartheid did so in the name in order to achieve democracy. There is no doubt, therefore, that the concept of democracy has been abused, misrepresented, confused, and even elusive in time and space. The distortions and political misrepresentations of democracy are most of the time deliberate and politically motivated. Implicit in the universal desire by politicians to associate themselves with democracy, however, is the moral virtue inherent in the concept of democracy. The reality of a genuine democratic process. From a moral perspective, democracy and protection of human rights cannot be separated. The truth behind this fact is rarely recognized or even understood. Protection of human rights, even though often ignored due to conflicting political interests, is nevertheless ultimately driven by the moral distinction between what is perceived as right and what is perceived as wrong in human behavior, and a state of social, and political, in the state of political reality. There is a moral element in democracy which has not yet been appreciated by scholars of human rights, political scientists, and scholars of jurisprudence. We believe this will soon change as people begin to understand the close relationship between morality, democracy, and the need to protect human rights. The nature and function of democracy. In spite of its moral ambiguity and being associated with different types of undemocratic regimes, we firmly believe that the concept of democracy can be given a definition that is relatively clear and unambiguous, in which all components of democracy are spelled out. In the contemporary political system, democracy exists first when the equality of all people is recognized and guaranteed under the law. Without equality, any claim to democracy is hollow. Many political systems which regard themselves democratic but are plagued with inequality have a long way to go towards full democratization. In fact, due to social change, the process of democratization can never come to a final end. Second, the rights of the people to freely assemble, associate, and express themselves must be protected and enforced by the law in a democratic society. Unreasonable restrictions on the manner, time, and place of assembly, association, and expression amount to suppression of freedom and therefore denial of democracy. All societies, due to social change, must be continually engaged in the definition of the boundaries of freedom, privacy, and exclusive domain of autonomy of the individual and the groups to which he or she belongs. Third, free, fair, and regular elections must be guaranteed and conducted peacefully. A free and fair electoral process puts all candidates on a level ground, free from corruption and cheating. Financing of the electoral process is vulnerable to corruption and inequality. Therefore, civil society has to be vigilant to the vulnerability which cannot be easily removed from the regime culture of one established democratic system. Fourth, under a democratic system, all people must feel secure in their person or rights to property. A democratic social environment guarantees security for all people. And fifth, in a democratic system, there must be separation of church from state. The right to freely worship religion must be guaranteed. However, religion should be devoted exclusively, in my opinion, to spiritual matters. Politics should deal with material needs of the people. Religious law, like customary law in a democratic society, is personal law, which should apply only to those who freely consent to be bound by it. The principles of equality and personal liberty prohibit the imposition of religious law or Sharia on those who do not believe in or subscribe to the faith of a specific religion or sect of a particular religion. From the definition of democracy above, democratization must be a secular endeavor which has no specific beginning or end. All political systems are eventually, constantly undergoing democratization, and therefore must expand efforts to ensure the protection of human rights listed above, which I have gone through, which make up the different components of democracy on a permanent basis, which can only be achieved through democratization. As society changes, so should the norms, that is, rules and standards that govern society and promote democracy, security, and freedom and autonomy of the individual and all members of the community. If we can define democracy relatively accurately, we should be able to recognize its absence and or subversion. This process should remain infinitely active because social change constantly transforms the social landscape by transforming or changing social norms. It is the process of working towards the achievement of all the different components of democracy that we characterize as democratization. Democratization, by its nature, and as conceived here, is an endless process. Both experience and history have taught us that a political system that is democratic cannot be established instantaneously by simply enacting a new constitution. People's commitment and desires, not with, or even aspirations, notwithstanding. Democratization is not similar to exercising exercising the Ten Commandments as Moses did on Mount Sinai. Democratization, because of inevitable social change, includes or enables progress. It is part of progress, social progress. We may compare a democratic political system to a healthy human body. Just as maintaining a healthy body requires constant attention and care, maintaining a democratic system demands constant vigilance, a demand for transparency, and a regular renewal of vision and leadership. Just as the body undergoes aging, social change is inevitable in a political system. Democracy is the means that keeps a political system healthy, vigorous, efficient, and strong enough to accomplish the needs of society. For the new political systems, democratization is the process that allows a system to mature and become strong and healthy enough in order to accomplish its objectives of protecting individuals and groups. Therefore, in order to establish a democratic political system, democratic institutions operated by imperfect human beings must be created. A legal infrastructure to sustain democracy through those institutions has to be developed and thereafter maintained without being corrupted and manipulated to the advantage of a few. But even more important, in order for democracy to take root in a new political system or environment and retain its vitality in the long run, factors that are incompatible with democracy have to be either constantly removed or neutralized. In addition, democratization requires the removal of obstacles that normally stand in the way of democracy, such as illiteracy, poverty, corruption, discrimination, and other forms of unfairness that undermine the freedom and the equality of the people, and therefore it affects their enjoyment of democracy. Finally, democracy not only requires a certain level of social change and consciousness within the political system, democracy is responsible for activating social change necessary for the political system to either to attain the capacity to function effectively and operate optimally in a transparent manner that is sustainable in the long run. The achievement of these conditions presupposes creating a political system capable of protecting human rights law. Democratization and enforcement of human rights law therefore go hand in hand. Democratization amounts to the same thing as establishing a political system able to effectively and fairly protect human rights. We shall, in the following conversations next week, we will briefly narrate the historical origins of the international movement to protect human rights that ultimately eliminated and created the universal process of democratization. The movement to condemn and expose abuse of human rights developed a unique script which has a specific format and content. This movement and its human rights script are responsible for activating the democratization process in different countries, especially in Africa. In another conversation, we will examine the schools of jurisprudence which have shaped our modern conception of human rights, and therefore over time our understanding of the meaning and the function of democracy in the modern political system. There are three schools of jurisprudence we will focus on. These are positivism, realism, and more recently, the critical legal studies school of thought. Jurisprudence shapes the legal doctrines which eventually may crystallize into dogmatic ideologies that become counterproductive in the legal system to the effective application of the human rights law enshrined in the Bill of Rights. In the U.S., for example, the Supreme Court is divided into liberal and conservative wings of the court. The decisions of the Supreme Court are often predictable depending on which wing of the Supreme Court controls the majority of the Supreme Court. This is clear evidence of ideological politicization of the Supreme Court. Ideological legal doctrine is not the best method of rational enforcement of human rights law. The U.S. Supreme Court has developed two methods of interpreting the Constitution, commonly referred to as textualism and originalism. A critique of these two methods will be done in our future conversations in order to illustrate the shortcomings of merely criticizing legal doctrine without causal explanation of the social and political process. Much more than a critique of the legal doctrines is therefore needed in order to explain the causal relationship between a doctrine and social structure. In another conversation, will move us beyond the critique of methodology to causal explanation. Because society is not static, textualism and originalism, as exemplified in the U.S. Supreme Court cannot give us the real meaning of the decisions of a transformed or changed society. Causal explanation, therefore, becomes very important. Critical legal studies, which is an intellectual movement, is not a legal theory. It is therefore not equipped to provide causal explanation to enable us to transcend the content of ideological legal doctrines. We move from a critique of methodology to a causal explanation because the content of legal doctrines has substantive consequences on society itself and its structures, as some of the cases we shall use to illustrate this very process. I think we have come to the end of our time. My time is over, and I'll stop there. Don't be scared about the abstract nature of the conclusion I've made today. I'll explain it further and make it more concrete and relate how human rights, the protection of human rights, is inseparable from democracy. So until next week, I will bid you farewell, and we'll welcome you next week to another conversation, hopefully